ladies and gentlemen, to today's panel on the American elections and especially their impact here in the Middle East. I am Assistant Professor Mark Deets. I'm an Assistant Professor in the History Department and also the Director of the Alaa El-Hadidi Center for American Studies and Research here at AUC. And it's my pleasure to be joined by a handful of my colleagues here for whom I have a great deal of respect. For those of you who haven't heard, the Alaa El-Hadidi Center for American Studies and Research, we're actually located not too far from here, actually right next door to TBS. As you're sort of walking towards the admin building, you'll see a big door on the left that says the Alaa El-Hadidi Center for American Studies and Research. Anyway, that's where we are. We were established in 2003 by a gift from Prince Al-Wali from the Saudi royal family, who established after the attacks of 9/11, 2001. He wanted to foster understanding between the Middle East and the West. And so he created two American Study Centers here in the Middle East, one here at AUC and one at AUB in Beirut. He established Islamic Studies Centers in the UK, one at Cambridge, another one at Edinburgh, and then one at Harvard and one at Georgetown in America. So there have been a few other players kind of added to that network. The network is still collaborating, still working on things. But anyway, that's how this institution came about, and that's basically how this talk came about. So this is probably the only portion of the whole thing where somebody's going to be standing. I decided to stand for the introduction, but for the most part, I think we're going to be sitting and really having a discussion here between some very experienced and accomplished scholars. So first of all, I'll kind of introduce these gentlemen in order of appearance in terms of kind of the beginning of their part of the talk, and then we'd really love to turn it into a discussion. We'd love to hear from you and your thoughts about the election thus far and what the possible implications are for the MENA region. So first of all, I'll start at the far end of the table there. He's going to be going first. This is my colleague in the History Department, Dr. Mouness Hojairi. Dr. Hojairi earned his master's and his PhD from Columbia University. And his BA in Political Science and Public Administration from AUB. He has taught history of the MENA region at Bard College as well as Vassar College. Since joining AUC, he's been teaching courses on the history of Islam, the history of the Middle East, Arab nationalism, nationalist theory, as well as the history of modern Lebanon and Greater Syria. So Mouness and I share an interest in nationalism. His research is focused primarily on history writing and identity formation, with a stress on sectarian identities and religious historiography. He also published a book in 2021 with the AUC Press, and that book is called Writing the History of Mount Lebanon, Church Historians and Maronite Identity. And he's currently working on a chapter with Oxford University Press's National Epics Project, with a chapter on Lebanon. So that is Mouness Hojairi. Next up, we'll have Dr. Sean Lee. Sean Lee is an assistant professor of political science here at AUC, and he received his PhD from Northwestern University in America. Previously, he was a doctoral fellow at the Orient Institute, Beirut, and a research affiliate with the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies at AUB. His work focuses on minority communities during times of conflict, in particular in Lebanon and Syria. So you can see that he and Dr. Hojairi share some common interests here. Dr. Sean has also conducted field work in Lebanon, Turkey, Tunisia, Germany, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then finally, last but not least, we'll have my colleague and CASAR talk. His name is Alaa El-Hadidi. Dr. El-Hadidi is a retired Egyptian diplomat and the former ambassador from Egypt to Turkey, Russia, and Romania. He's currently an adjunct professor at the AUC. Over his 30 years in foreign policy, he's conducted a lot of research and writing. From 2006 to 2007, he was the spokesperson for the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. From 2007 to 2010, he was the Egyptian ambassador to Turkey. And then from 2010 to 2012, he was Egypt's ambassador to Russia, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. From 2012 to 2013, he was the spokesperson for the Egyptian Prime Minister. He was the director of the Institute for Diplomatic Studies in Cairo. Afterwards, he was appointed to be Egypt's ambassador to Romania. In addition, he's also held diplomatic assignments at Egypt's embassies in the United States and Jordan. So he served in the embassy in Washington, D.C. and in Moscow. Dr. El-Hadidi has a BA in political science from the American University in Cairo, but we'll go ahead and excuse that. It's a joke. It's a historian's joke. My political science colleagues, anyway, nobody thinks it's funny, but I do. He also has a PhD in political science from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And he was also a fellow at the Center for International Studies at Harvard University. So the plan, that's all three of our panelists. So join me with a small round of applause for welcome. And basically we're going to start with all three of them giving some opening remarks for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to open it up for them to maybe be able to respond to each other. And then we'll open it up to the entire audience for at least the last 20-25 minutes to hear from you all what your thoughts are about this election and the potential implications for the MENA region. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hojairi.
Thank you, Mark. First of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for organizing this. As someone who's tasked with dealing with the diaspora, so essentially today I'm talking about the Arab American community and essentially not necessarily predicting, but analyzing how it might vote, and then talking about repercussions for that community. So first of all, I'm going to be very clear that in order to avoid falling in the pitfalls of, when talking about a vast diaspora community and generalizing about it, I'm restricting everything I'm saying today to Michigan, only Michigan. And I have my reasons. There's a rationale for that. Number one, the size of the community. This is basically the largest concentration. But number two, my reasons for that is how politically potent that community is. So in the case of Michigan, we're not just talking about possibly the largest concentration of Arab Americans anywhere in the Union. Due to the way Michigan is structured, due to the size of the state, and due to how the Arab American community in Michigan is mobilized, organized, and so on, that is a very politically active and potent. What I mean by potent, meaning at the state and federal levels, that community is essentially guaranteed representation. So someone like Rashida Tlaib, the Palestinian American, congresswoman from Michigan, from Wayne County, is almost guaranteed, or someone like her, is guaranteed to be elected into office. Doesn't matter what lobbying happens, doesn't matter how much AIPAC puts money and effort behind it, you can't basically shut down that process. But also, it also means that, if you lose the bulk of that community, you're on a very high risk to lose Michigan as a state. And that's the big deal here. So recently, you might have been reading in the news how, we should invent a new word other than offensive when we talk about the remarks of Donald Trump. But let's say offensive remarks made by Donald Trump about Puerto Ricans, for instance. Well, how much will that impact, how many electoral votes will that directly rob him from? Well, Puerto Rico doesn't factor in that. But the state of Michigan has 15 electoral votes, meaning if you lose Michigan, especially if you're a Democrat and you lose Michigan, that's a very big deal. Your chances are really reduced. To give you an impression, in 2016, the Democrats lost Michigan by about 12,000 votes. The uncommitted, and I'm going to be very clear here, uncommitted recently, this is not only Arab Americans in Michigan, but the uncommitted in Michigan this summer were upward of 100,000 votes. And again, we know that those aren't exactly people who voted for Trump last time. So in a way, again, that's why I'm focused on that Arab American community. And here I want to say a few words about the composition and the organization of the Arab American community and a little bit of its history politically. Number one, this is not a community that overall, coalesced gradually over decades in Michigan. The three main pillars of that community are Lebanese Americans, Iraqi Americans, and Yemeni Americans. Many others, I'm ignoring them, we don't have the time to go over everyone, but those are the three pillars of the Arab Americans in Michigan. And at least for two out of these communities, those came in bulk and in one historical process primarily. So although Lebanese Americans go back to late 19th, early 20th century, the largest community today in Michigan of Lebanese Americans really date back to the 1970s and 80s, and they're specifically from southern Lebanon. So she's from southern Lebanon. And they're partially, and sometimes directly, the outcome of US-supported Israeli ethnic cleansing of southern Lebanon. So, the mayor of Dearborn Heights today is from Bint Jbeil originally, the family at least. The mayor of Dearborn, again, the family is from Bint Jbeil, southern Lebanon. So these are not, again, these came in bulk and they're the direct outcome of an ethnic cleansing campaign conducted by Israel in the 70s and 80s in southern Lebanon. So you can guess, how much that has of an impact on the community, its political orientation, and so on. The Iraqi community, the Iraqi American community in Michigan is partially the outcome of essentially fleeing Saddam Hussein in the 1990s. Again, in bulk, in mass. Now, I mentioned those two communities specifically because they're also Shi'i communities with deep ties to the Shi'i ecosystem, let's call it, in the Middle East, going from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Syrian regime to Iraq and, of course, to Iran. So voting and, again, political implications, when you look at them, you have to consider those issues. We can't make that statement concerning Yemeni Americans in Michigan. Primarily Sunnis, primarily, for instance, not aligned with the Houthi movement in the Yemen. So when it comes to, when my colleagues talk about implications for what would happen in the Middle East under Trump versus Harris, well, again, this is not one, black-white when it comes to Arab Americans in Michigan. Because, again, some are clearly supportive of a hard line against Iran, others are definitely not. But here's the thing, the one thing that that entire community, and I'm gonna make this statement without the numbers, but I could just make it and I'll take that chance. The one thing that that community does not disagree on is Palestine. So, and again, this doesn't make our job easier today in making predictions or in foreseeing outcomes, but on any other year, let's call it on a non-genocide year, Harris would win easy. In fact, there's no way that a Republican would win it. But unfortunately also, again, it is a genocide year, and Harris is the vice president of Joe Biden. So you cannot get rid of that. It also doesn't make our job easier when the other candidate is Donald Trump. Because again, I could make the statement that any other Republican candidate would be a slam dunk under these conditions. So if you are a voter in Wayne County, Michigan, which includes Hamtramck, Dearborn, Dearborn Heights, those cities are in the news all the time. In fact, the three mayors have endorsed Trump so far. Again, this is where a bulk of the Arab American community is located in. This is the district that votes for Rashid Tlaib, for example, to Congress. Again, in that sphere, if it were anyone other than Donald Trump, this wouldn't even be a question. So, but right now, this is where we are at. We have an overtly racist, fascist Republican candidate with a history that we've seen. And then we have a Democratic candidate who is the vice president of possibly the most pro-Israel president in the history of the United States, but also someone who happened to be, overtly Zionist supporter of Israel when this genocide is happening. And finally, I want to say also that this isn't just about Palestine. I'm going to go back to the Arab American community, the Lebanese American community in Michigan. Those are people who are directly tied to where all the fighting is taking place in Lebanon right now. These are from the front row towns and villages in southern Lebanon. So this is a direct, issue for that community. And this is again where a community that is potent politically is forced to kind of make a nuclear decision, a nuclear option, meaning I'm going to tear the house down, because in many cases that's how voting Trump or abstaining is considered. This is how certain Democratic, lobbyists are trying to portray, as in, are you going to vote Trump? How can you vote Trump? Or how could you not vote for Harris? And the answer is here in the sense that there's a perception that what the Democrats have done, what specifically Joe Biden has done, has to carry a price, a political price. And what we've seen so far is, well, three things. One, boycotting, as in staying home. Two, voting, third option, Greens, Jill Stein, or simply uncommitted. And all of those really affect Harris, not Trump, meaning Trump doesn't have to do the traditional, campaigning in Michigan where you're trying to capture voters, make them vote for you. In the case of Michigan and Trump, all he has to do is simply make people convinced not to vote Harris. And unfortunately, ever since she became candidate, she has not done enough to actually address that, meaning plenty of people are actually going in that option. The numbers, and I'm very conservative, very careful about not going with the story that the polls show us. They've been wrong a lot in recent years. But still, my own suspicion is the damage is quite significant. I will not be shocked if actually Harris loses Michigan, which is, again, traditionally considered part of the blue wall that guarantees Democrats the election. And again, given the numbers that we have, official numbers, Harris lost in 2024 in order of magnitude more votes than what Hillary lost in 2016. And again, like I said, repercussions for the community post-election, well, they're varied. Because again, when we talk about things that are just offensive to all Muslim Americans, let's say, not to mention that the Arab American community is not all Muslims, but the Muslim Act basically that does not affect that community the way it affects other Arab American communities in the rest of the continental US. That's number one. Number two, in terms of taxation and fiscal policies and so on, this is not a working class community either. So the backbone and the glue that holds the community together is primarily a vast association of extended families tied to small business. So in many ways, a section of this community used to vote Democrat against their immediate economic, benefit for cultural reasons, political reasons, and so on. And I feel that the Democrats have completely wiped out all of those terms. And now we're dealing with, well, Michigan post. So, but like everyone, I'm actually just basically anticipating the next few days just to see exactly the scale of the damage. I'll stop here and I'll open the floor for my colleagues.
Yeah, please go ahead and hand the mic to Sean. As Mouness, Dr. Hojairi said, I've asked him to talk about the Arab diaspora in America. Dr. Sean to focus on the politics here in the Middle East, and then Dr. Alaa to talk about the implications internationally as the former diplomat, especially vis-a-vis Russia and China and some of the BRICS countries. So With that said, go ahead, Dr. Shah.
All right, thank you again for showing up. I'll be brief and limit my comments, I think, to Lebanon and Palestine. I think that, especially being next to Dr.Alaa, he's much more qualified to speak to the situation for Egypt, so if you want to include that in the international purview. So I would say, looking at what's happening today in Lebanon, looking at the kind of escalating conflict there, essentially, replaying some scenes that we've seen from 1982 with the Israeli invasion of the South and just the mass bombing of the country, and in particular Shia areas of the country. I would say I don't see, there's been some talk recently of kind of possibilities of a ceasefire and an off-ramp, a decoupling of Lebanon from Gaza. I don't see that happening. That looks like, again, I think some talk before the elections. My sense is that whether we see a Trump presidency or a Harris administration, that we will likely see kind of more of the same of what we've been seeing for the last month or two in Lebanon. And so I'm pretty pessimistic on that front. My sense is that the situation in Lebanon will be more driven by the facts, the military facts on the ground, the tactical, failures of the Israeli ground invasion. So I can see if the kind of Israeli military casualties continue to escalate in the south, then that might be something that drives pressure, domestic Israeli pressure, to kind of find some sort of an off-ramp. But I'm not very optimistic in either of those U.S. administrations in kind of creating a ceasefire in Lebanon. We've seen with Hochstein and people like Brett McGurk that they essentially have greenlit this invasion of Lebanon, and so I don't see that certainly not getting any better under the Trump presidency. So that's it for the short and medium term in Lebanon. We'll see how that plays out militarily. For Palestine, afraid I also don't have any good news. So I don't know if you guys have seen, but Trump's former ambassador to Israel is a guy named David Friedman, and he's just recently come out with what he is considering his quote-unquote peace plan, which is called One Jewish State. So the idea here is essentially just kind of permanent subjugation and apartheid, and that pressure on Palestinians to leave, some sort of residency permit system, but no real rights, certainly no political rights, no limited civil rights as well. So something like we see in the situation of people in East Jerusalem, perhaps. Now I can see, we've seen in some of the campaigning, and we've seen, I think one of Trump's sons is married to a Lebanese, or the other way around, one of his daughters is married to a Lebanese guy. And so we've seen some kind of, attempts by the Trump administration to imply that he would have a different policy when it comes to Palestine and Gaza more specifically. But we've also seen him saying that he thinks that Biden has been too hard on the Israelis and that he should let them, finish the job. So my sense is that when he says that the war has to end, what he means is a kind of, it needs to win in a really destructive way, right? So to the extent that the Israelis have the gloves on at all, which I think is hard to imagine at this point after so many people killed, my sense is that he would like to see it even harder in Gaza. For a Harris administration, unfortunately what we've seen in American politics is that I think policy towards Israel tends to work like a ratchet in the sense that it only kind of moves in one direction. So it's not clear to me that the Biden administration would have moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, would have recognized the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights as legitimate, things like that. But we see that the Biden administration, once Trump did those things, they didn't go back on them, right? So we see a movement, but a movement really just in one direction. So my sense is for Harris, it would be kind of a status quo issue, in that we would continue to see similar policies for Palestine. The main difference that I can imagine is that perhaps if the Israelis were to announce, new settlements in Gaza, the Harris administration might at least say that they don't think that's a good idea, whereas the Trump administration probably wouldn't mind one way or the other. My sense is that the main differences would be rhetorical and less in the policies. So the Trump administration would not be wedded to even the rhetoric of a two-state solution, whereas the Harris administration at least pretends that they're interested in this and see this as a viable outcome, even if it ends up just in practice being a kind of cover for I would say, indefinite occupation and more of the same. So again, no real good news on that front. I would say the one main difference that we might expect to see, and even with this it's hard to say because the Trump himself is rather unpredictable, but we could see a difference in policy towards Iran. So one thing that we've noticed is the Biden administration has been very hesitant in kind of a full-out escalation against Iran, and my sense is that the Trump administration might be a little less hesitant in that regard, mostly because it's full of people who have, for decades, wanted to have a war with Iran. But it's, again, Trump is kind of a wild card on this, and so I could imagine him maybe vetoing something like that or going along with it, just depending on the whim of the day. So I know that's not a very systematic or structural way of thinking about American foreign policy, but to some extent, I think that personalities do matter, and on that one particular instance, I think that might be the case. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Sean. And now over to former ambassador and Dr.Alaa El-Hadidi.
Thank you, Mark. I want to start by saying something about Tim Sullivan. He was my professor when I was a student here as an undergraduate, and he taught me something: compare, contrast, and evaluate. And this is the kind of motto which I carried on since graduation until today. So what we're going to do today, since we are in Tim Sullivan's lounge, is compare, contrast, and evaluate both Harris and Trump when it comes to Russia, when it comes to China, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to the European Union. Let me start by Russia, because the big question is, of course, what's going to happen to American-Russian relations. Let me explain a little bit the mindset of the Russians, and in order to understand and maybe even have some insights about how things are going to develop. One of the things which I learned when I was in Russia was that they have a deep sense of pride and surprise, but they like to be treated as a superpower. They like to be treated as equals. And they will never, ever forget what Obama said about them, that they are second-rate power. They will never, ever forgive Hillary Clinton for speaking about democracy inside Russia. Now, if you know the Russian regime, I'm not going to enter into that, the word democracy, human rights is anathema. And they will, it has been rumored, it has been said without any hard evidence that in 2016, Putin was in favor of Trump, not because of his love to Trump, but because of his hatred to Hillary Clinton, who was accused of trying to foment troubles inside Russia from the Russian point of view by speaking about democracy, which means, in other words, using the language used by diplomats and political scientists, regime change. So for them, for Putin and the current regime in Russia, the Democrats are for the regime change, while the Republicans never ever mentioned the term democracy in Russia, never ever mentioned human rights. So for them, at least Republicans are not calling for a regime change inside Russia. And this makes a hell of a difference. Why? Because the starting point for the Russians is that if you treat me as a superpower, then we can sit together and we can start bargaining. But if you treat me like a second-rate power, if you treat me like any other third-world country in which you are speaking about democracy, human rights, and regime change, then we have nothing to discuss. And this leads me to Trump, in that when he says that he would solve the Ukrainian war in less than 24 hours, actually he has some notion that he knows that the Russians will listen to him. He knows that by speaking about Russia as a superpower, he is laying the ground for a future deal, for a future negotiations with Russia. And the Russians do respect that. The Russians are willing for that. Actually, the Russians want that. What they do not want is somebody to come and lecture them about human rights or democracy. So in a sense that if we have a Harris administration, forget about any improvement in American-Russian relations. If you have a Trump administration, it's the beginning of something. Not that the Russians view Trump that he's going to be more friendly. For them, they're not naive. The Russians are not naive. They know quite well that America is their foe. They know quite well that America is their enemy. But the difference is that there is an enemy you can deal with, and there is an enemy you do not deal with. So for them, if a Trump administration comes, it doesn't mean that the sanctions imposed by the United States over Russia are going to be withdrawn or cancelled in 24 hours. It doesn't mean that things are going to get rosy, but at least they can start speaking about Ukraine, which is a top priority for Russia. You can imagine that. And also a top priority for the United States when it comes to its global vision and what's happening in Europe. So, will they compromise on Ukraine? Probably not, but at least, not probably. Actually, I don't think they were going to compromise about Ukraine, but there is going to be on speaking terms with Trump and his administration, and maybe get concessions in other parts of the world. This leads me to Ukraine. I wouldn't like to be in Ukraine's shoes at the moment. For them, this is the worst time. For them, they are the most nervous of all the countries in the world about the outcome of this election. I am sure that Zelensky doesn't sleep at night and keeps on watching American TV channels, whether CNN, Fox, and trying to follow the latest polls. Because for him, this is a matter of life or death. If Harris gets elected, as Dr. Schoen said about the Middle East, it will be almost the same policy like Biden. They will continue supporting the Ukrainian, not the kind of support the Ukrainians would love, but at least support will continue to some degree or the other. But if Trump comes, this is going to be a very, very difficult time for Ukraine, especially that at the moment Ukraine is suffering from lack of manpower, lack of ammunition, lack of even political support inside Ukraine for the war. So for them, I am sure that the Ukrainians, and even I heard it today while coming to the AUC on the BBC. In the morning, there was an interview with some Ukrainian fighters in Zaporizhia, the front in the south, and it was almost, the message which was conveyed was that they are praying for Harris to come, because they know if Trump comes, he will force them to some concessions which they do not want. And the question becomes, if Trump comes, what kind of concessions will the Ukrainians accept or will not accept? And what kind of pressure will Trump impose on the Ukrainians to accept his proposed deal with Russia? And this leads me to NATO and Europeans, because as you all know, Trump made news all over the world, especially in Europe, about his intentions towards NATO. Now, those who are supporting Trump would say that he was just threatening. He doesn't really mean what he is saying. He doesn't really intend to withdraw from NATO. But for many other observers, for many other countries, they are very, very worried about the Trump administration and the relationship between the United States and NATO. And to what extent will the United States continue supporting NATO? It's not black and white, not withdrawing completely from NATO, but at least limiting its assistance to NATO. Now, I'm not qualified to tell you exactly how much the United States spends on NATO. At one point, the United States was spending 80% of NATO's budget. Today, it's not 80%. I don't know how much, 50%, maybe 60%. But when Trump comes, definitely it's going to be lower than that. And when Trump comes, definitely there's going to be some structural changes in NATO. And to the dismay of some European countries, especially in Eastern Europe, especially the Baltic states, they want full American support vis-a-vis Russia, which Trump is not going to do. Trump, with his mentality, business mentality, is arguing that, okay, if you want me to protect you, you have to pay for it. So how much you're going to pay? And by the way, between inverted commas, we'll come to that later, it also applies to Taiwan. It also applies to Asia. So if Trump comes, NATO is going to be in serious trouble. NATO role will be diminished. NATO will have to adjust, European countries in NATO will have to adjust to new reality. And for the Europeans, it's not only just about NATO, it's also, there's another calamity coming to them, which is their trade relations with the United States. Now, whether it's Harris or Trump, economically speaking, and speaking about trade, speaking about financial resources, all that stuff, this is bad news for Europe. Europe, when it comes to trade, when it comes to the economy, is going to be losing, whether it's Trump or Harris. Now, I don't know how many of you have followed what the Biden administration has done in terms of trying to promote the industrial base inside the United States, the green economy, what is called the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, for many Europeans, the Biden administration is subsidizing their industry, and this is in complete violation of free trade agreements. And they're afraid from competition coming from a rising American industry, fully supported or partially, not fully, it's not China, partially supported by the United States, in which they feel they're losing to American companies. So for the Europeans, if Trump comes, it's going to be NATO and the economy, because Trump has also promised to increase tariffs across the board by 10%, 20%, which means he's not only targeting China, he's targeting also the European Union. But at least if Harris comes, it's going to be only the tariffs, only the economy. And at least they will have the benefit of NATO country. This leads me to my final point, which is China. Now, China is, of course, in the eyes of the Americans, the enemy number one, not Russia. Russia, yeah, it's a nuisance. Russia is a threat. Russia is at war with a European ally, all that stuff. But the main threat, if you read the American national security strategy, it says it very, very clearly. China is the main threat. China is the main enemy. Now, how do the Chinese see it? How do the Chinese differentiate between Trump and Harris? The same way, like, let's say the Russians, that's where they differ from the Russians. The Chinese, for them, whether it's Harris or it's Trump, it's going to be a very difficult situation, maybe even confrontation. Except that also knowing Trump, knowing his business mentality, knowing his transactional character, that he might tend to seek a bargain with China. He has said publicly that Japan has to pay for American protection, that South Korea has to pay for American protection. Even Taiwan, which is considered a kind of, I don't know how to call it, kind of a taboo subject in American politics, but even Taiwan has to pay for its own protection. Will it mean that Trump can abandon Taiwan the same way he's saying about Ukraine? We'll have to wait and see. But at least for Trump, he is taking a position that for the Chinese, there is a kind of an opening, different from the way the Russians see this opening. The opening for the Chinese is that they can maybe reach a trade agreement with him. Not that they cannot reach a trade agreement with Harris, but it's more likely with Trump. Now, how will that translate into Chinese intentions concerning Taiwan? In my humble opinion, I'm not a Chinese expert, the Chinese definitely want to reunite Taiwan with the mainland. They want to incorporate it, but unlike the West, for them, they can wait. They can wait for another 100 years. There's a famous quotation by one of the Western journalists asking Xi Jinping, who was the Prime Minister of China during Mao's period, how do you evaluate the French Revolution? You will remember when was the French Revolution. And his answer was, it was too early to speak about its results. This is the Chinese mindset. They are for the long term. So whatever Harris comes, Trump comes, another 4 years, but we have our own designs, we have our own plan, and it could take us 10 years, to take us 50 years, at the end we'll reach it. So that is the way they think. I hope I didn't take much time, and thank you very much.
No, it's perfect. Thank you. So since we started a bit late, unless one of you three has like a burning issue that you need to talk about among us, I'd like to open the floor for comments and questions from our audience. So please, and perhaps we could get a microphone. Yeah, you can have this one.
I'll ask my question first. I just wanted to ask about the implications for Egypt. The implications for Egypt.
Maybe we need another one.
Yeah.
Maybe the other one.
This one works.
This one.
I just want to ask what the implications for Egyptian politics and do you think that with Trump policies would be more beneficial for Egyptian objectives?
Okay, is that for anybody or?
Everybody.
Okay.
Should we take a couple? And then
Yeah, let's take maybe 3 questions and then respond. So we got one in the back here.
You can speak up.
Go ahead, yeah, project your voice.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I just have kind of 2 small questions and more to Dr. about Russian-US relations. So I wanted to ask if the situation of we include kind of like Ukraine will join the NATO. And another question is about the BRICS organization. So how you think the US will it react? Will they react on the BRICS kind of expanding and gaining influence or not?
BRICS.
What?
BRICS.
BRICS.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another one? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
I'm still looking desperately for an end to the genocide, so what about a BRICS-oriented? Is there any possibility that kind of coalition could finally stand up and say that's enough beating up on the Middle East?
Okay, great question. Thank you. Should we start? Okay, yes, ma'am. We'll take one more.
My feeling is that Harris is a better human being, and she sympathizes with the Middle East a little bit. But I also know that she cannot change American policy, at least during this critical time. Let's assume she wins on Tuesday. Can't anything be done? I mean, as far as the administration is concerned, the more firm on Israeli practices and all that. In this interim period, I mean, if she's guaranteed the presidency.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll
yeah.
start.
You wanna
I'll
start
with the last question.
The mic.
It's not really working. So in terms of I mean, again, time and again, we've been told, we've heard the argument that overall, objectively speaking, Harris is, if we're going to talk about the issue of Palestine, is objectively better between quotation mark and then underlined and colored, because we don't know what better really means. It's just that, again, overtly, Trump is, again, he is Trump. But what would that mean immediately in terms of the ceasefire? She has not committed to that, again, overtly. So no one has any say in what happens in Palestine except Israel and the United States, and of course, whatever the Palestinians can do. So other than those players, there's nothing else, BRICS or anyone or the region and in terms of what Israel does between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, IPAC makes sure that you don't exist in DC if you oppose Israeli policies. Exceptions are there. I mentioned Rashid al-Tayyib several times, yes, but there aren't many Wayne counties in the United States. That's why, again, Israel has unconditional support. That, and it is a strategic asset. It's an extension of the U.S. military, basically. You want to call it a colony, an imperial presence in the Middle East, whatever you want to call it, but ultimately, Harris or Trump, again, I think Sean has described it the best in terms of nothing will go back, but maybe things won't necessarily get worse, whatever worse is. There's always worse. We've learned that. This is the Middle East. In terms of the Ukraine, I think Alaa would be better suited to answer that one. So I'll just get past it.
Okay.
All right. Just real quickly on this question. I mean, my sense is that the only leverage that people have who oppose genocide in the United States is right now for the elections. And for better or for worse, my sense is even electorally for them for the worse, they've decided that they either don't care or that they don't need the support from people who oppose what's happening in Gaza. And so, I mean, the fact that they sent someone like Richie Torres, who's a hardcore Zionist Democrat to Michigan to campaign for Harris, the fact that they sent Bill Clinton, who just, I don't know if you guys have seen his recent remarks that were pretty outrageous and saying that well, I know you think that killing so many kids is bad and unexcusable. However, you have to, ask yourself, well, what would you do in the Israelis' position? So essentially justifying the genocide. So my sense is that any window that has been possible for change in U.S. foreign policy on Israel is essentially changing, is closing now. So as soon as the elections are over, there's no real, like, all of the leverage points are in the opposite direction. And so whether it's, you know, kind of cultural affinity, whether it's pro-Israel lobbying, whether it's, you know, evangelical support for Israel, all those things point in the opposite direction. And so we've seen sometimes, you know, for example, Reagan in 1982, picking up the phone and telling Israelis, okay, you have to stop the war right now. So it is possible. I mean, if they wanted to, they could cut off the faucet for the weapons supplies, and that would make a big difference. But I just don't see that happening with Harris, because I see that for them, politically speaking, domestically, it would be only bad things for them. And so if they win, then they will have learned the lesson that they don't need the vote in Michigan. They don't need the vote from young people, African Americans, Arabs, and Muslims who are opposed to the genocide. And if they lose, then it doesn't matter, because Trump is in power anyways. For the BRICS or other, you know, the third world more generally, I mean, there is always it's, you know, not used very often, but the UN General Assembly has this idea of uniting for peace. But to my mind, that would be more of a symbolic measure, because at the end of the day, without, unless you can stop American and German arms, you know, flooding into Israel, there's not really much that you can do. I mean, I don't see India and South Africa. I mean, already South Africa in the International Court of Justice, but I don't see South Africa, India, Brazil, you know, invading Israel. I mean, to the extent that we've seen any kind of R2P responsibility to protect, it has ironically been from non-state actors that are deemed terrorist organizations by the U.S. and Europe. So the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Iraqi militias. So yeah, not very optimistic on that front.
Okay.
And I think Alaa will have to be probably the final word. It's 1:57, so we're coming up on 2 o'clock. So, Alaa for the final word.
Okay, those of you who didn't clap for me, we're going to fail the course. Now, Egypt. It depends on what are your priorities. If your priority is Palestinian question, stability in the Middle East, ending the war in Lebanon, all that, then definitely it's not Trump. If your priority is the economy, building the country and having all the infrastructure which you are doing at the moment, etc., then of course you will prepare Trump. I cannot tell you for sure whether it's going to be this one or that one. It's not black and white. It's not 100% for this one. It's slightly vague. And finally, and not totally, it all will depend on the Egyptian leadership and how it's going to deal with this, whoever is going to be elected. Okay. The other thing, speaking about NATO, Ukraine. If I understood your question correctly, whether Russia would accept a kind of a deal in which Ukraine will be incorporated in NATO, right?
Will it happen rather?
One of the scenarios which is being promoted by some of the advisors of Trump is the West German model, in which West Germany was a member of NATO, and of course East Germany at that time was a member of the Warsaw Pact. So there would be the new version would be that Ukraine has to accept the fact that the eastern part, the parts which Russia has already occupied, will remain with Russia, and in exchange of that, Russia would allow the rest of what remains of Ukraine, which is 80% of the country, join NATO. Quite frankly, I doubt it. I doubted that the Russians would even accept that. Remember, the Russians went into Ukraine in the first place because of what was assumed to be Ukrainian intention to join NATO. The other scenario which is being promoted is that there will be a special kind of arrangement between NATO and Ukraine, in which Ukraine accepts a ceasefire, accepts the status quo, and there will be a relationship which is not a member of NATO, but at the same time, the closest it could be to NATO. Now, if I understand Russia quite well, which I don't claim, but at least, when you look at the beginning of the war, where the borders of NATO were, and now where the borders of NATO are. And I mean by that before the war, you had Sweden and Finland outside of NATO, and now Sweden and Finland. So I don't think the Russians will accept to be completely encircled by NATO when it comes to Europe. Now, how will Trump manage to solve that kind of dilemma? If Trump does not really believe in NATO, then the kind of compromise he is going to offer to the Russians and to the Ukrainians will exclude this part of NATO. The question then becomes, will the Ukrainians accept it? And some people are betting that the Ukrainians are in such a weak position now that whatever is going to be offered to them, they will have to accept it at the end of the road. And we will see. Thank you.
Thank you.